Coming up. But if you think about the extent to which the Iranian regime cracks down on free expression, thus giving us very limited visibility into the thoughts and beliefs of the Iranian people, there is every reason to be very encouraged by these protests and by this specific video. There may in fact be a massive wellspring of support for freedom and for Western ideals among the Iranian people, and that wellspring of support could be about to break free. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, the obvious thing to talk about is what's happening in Iran. Last week, we talked about the fact that President Trump authorized the drone strike which killed Iranian Quds Force commander Soleimani, the leading terrorist in the world, and we talked about what would be Iran's reaction. Well, now we know. And of course, there's no guarantee that they won't do more in the future, but at this point, it looks like that reaction was to launch approximately 15 missiles at U.S. military facilities in Iraq, incidentally not targeting the ones containing the largest numbers of American military personnel. And there is some indication that some sort of warning or notice reached the American military through Iraqis. As a result, the facilities suffered damage to buildings, but no Americans or Iraqis were killed or injured. The Iranian leadership then touted the fact that they'd struck U.S. facilities, and at one point the Iranian propaganda informed Iranian citizens that 30 Americans had been killed, even though in fact none had been killed. So what did President Trump do? Well, the purportedly out-of-control, unstable, unpresidential, warmongering commander-in-chief did not order a counterstrike. His conclusion, a very calm, calculated, intelligent decision, was to stand down and not respond militarily. Instead, he announced that he would impose additional economic sanctions on Iran. So what does this show? It showed once again that the media depiction of President Trump as out of control is simply wrong. I've lost track of the number of times their characterizations of him and their predictions as to the actions he would take have been so incredibly wrong that you really have to wonder whether the press has any idea what they're talking about. You really have to wonder whether they really believe it's actually in their interest to be right. As more of these instances stack up where they've completely mischaracterized the president and failed with their predictions, you have to ask yourself whether they've reached the conclusion that as a business, they've concluded that rather than being right, there's a greater return in issuing predictions which fit what their audience wants to hear, even when time after time after time, those predictions prove to be incorrect. I actually believe that the media outlets are destroying what credibility they had left, and they're doing so for what are inexorably shrinking returns as the population moves in greater and greater numbers to new media sources through the internet for news and opinion. So what else did Iran do besides lobbing 15 missiles at U.S. facilities in Iraq? Unfortunately, they shot down a Ukrainian civilian airliner, killing all 176 persons on board. Apparently, they mistook the airliner for a cruise missile. The regime's admission that they did so came after 3 days of false denials by the Iranian government that they had in fact shot down the airliner. By the time the government of the brutal theocracy admitted what it had done, the world basically knew what had happened. Video showed the moment of impact of the explosion of the missile intersecting the airliner's path. Nobody was buying their denials. What came next was a shock to a lot of people, including me. Thousands of Iranians took to the streets to call for the supreme leader Ali Khamenei to resign, to chant death to the Islamic Republic and our enemy is right here. They're lying that it's America. And they tore down the banners depicting General Soleimani. Now compare that to the claims made by the mainstream media that Soleimani was beloved by the Iranian people. Sort of makes you think the media in America was just taking the word of the Iranian government about the way Iranians felt about Soleimani. Now think about that in the context of what the Iranian government is and what Soleimani was. The Iranian government is a brutal theocracy which severely restricts the freedom of its citizenry, has used terror to try to inflict its will upon the Persian Gulf region and the entire Middle East, including the involvement of Soleimani in planning to blow up a prominent and popular restaurant in Washington, D.C., in an attempt to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador. It was that involvement which prompted then-President Obama to designate Soleimani as a terrorist. Think about that for a moment. How large could the death toll have been with bombing a popular restaurant in Washington, D.C.? So how big was the loss of Soleimani? Well, look at who they nominated to replace him. They nominated someone who, like Soleimani, was 62 years old. Soleimani was only 40 years old when he took over the Quds Force. I and others suspect that Iran would probably prefer to nominate a younger hard charger to the spot. So why didn't they? Well, some analysts have pointed out that the Iranian leadership probably doesn't have the flexibility they'd like to have because they don't know how the Americans were able to target Soleimani's convoy. How were they able to know the date and time of his arrival at the airport and departure from the airport and other specifics regarding his transportation? The Iranian leadership has to suspect that the leaks could have come from a very large number of people. But who? And how long is it going to take them to get to the bottom of those leaks? And the longer they take, the more hamstrung their forces will be. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why retired General David Petraeus described the taking out of Soleimani as a bigger development than the killing of Osama bin Laden or of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So back to the protests. Do I think they're going to bring down the Iranian government? I don't know, but I know they're not big enough to do that yet. I fear the Iranian government will crack down on the protesters just as they did during the November protests when up to 1,500 protesters were killed by that cruel government. President Trump sent out an inspirational tweet stating that, quote, "We are following your protests closely and are inspired by your courage." He also warned against, quote, "another massacre of peaceful protesters," close quote. It's noteworthy that he sent tweets in both English and Farsi, and one of them ended up being the most liked tweet in Farsi in the history of Twitter. We're not going to war to support Iranian protesters, but President Trump calling attention to their plight and to the prior brutal crackdown on protesters by the Iranian regime puts unwanted world attention on the regime, and that is a good thing. The more under the microscope the regime becomes, the more reluctant they may be to take extreme action. As I noted last week, I appreciate that President Trump announced that he's not seeking regime change in Iran. Having said that, regime change there would be a good thing. We just shouldn't go to war to produce that result. Incidentally, as we've talked about before on this podcast, we're often at a disadvantage in following world events because we're simply not there and we have to rely on the media to keep us advised. The internet has changed much of that, but that comes with its own set of risks, of course. Trying to figure out what the public under a dictatorship actually believes is a very difficult thing. From the earliest episodes of this podcast, we've talked about the concept of a preference cascade, which can lead to rapid changes in governments when the public, most often in a dictatorial environment, realizes that large numbers of their fellow citizens actually oppose the government, but have been unwilling or unable to express those thoughts because of fear of retribution. There is, of course, a possibility that a preference cascade is coming in Iran, and the theocracy will be overthrown, but it's far too early to tell. However, there's some interesting tidbits about Iranian society that have been revealed in these protests, and they revealed that much of what we think we understand based on media coverage, we don't understand at all. Multiple observers of the protests at Beheshti University in Iran noticed something that happened with regard to flags. I'm not talking about flags on flagpoles or hanging on buildings. I'm talking about a plaza where two enormous depictions of flags were incorporated into the base of the plaza, side by side. One flag was the American flag, and the other was the Israeli flag. They were obviously placed there so that people would have to walk across them, thus showing disrespect for the countries they represent. The interesting tidbit that came out of the protests was footage of this plaza and the way the crowd walked across it. Enormous crowds moved through, but nearly all of them walked around the flags, not on them. My rough estimate is that well over 95% of the crowd walked around the edge of the plaza. And it was the edge that was crowded. The center over the flags was open. It was the easiest walk. But instead, over 95%, well over 95% of the crowd walked around the edge of the plaza rather than going straight across, which would have placed them on top of the flags. Does that really mean that these crowds were deliberately making sure not to offend the U.S. or Israel? Well, included in the videos posted on Twitter was one where a couple of Iranians apparently very deliberately walked out onto the American flag and the crowd erupted in a chant of shame in Farsi. They literally were trying to shame a fellow Iranian for showing disrespect towards the U.S. Now, we have to be careful about taking our conclusions too far based on just these videos. After all, these are crowds primarily of the young, primarily college students. And after all, the individuals in these videos presumably are those who chose to protest. But if you think about the extent to which the Iranian regime cracks down on free expression, thus giving us very limited visibility into the thoughts and beliefs of the Iranian people, there's every reason to be very encouraged by these protests and by this specific video. There may, in fact, be a massive wellspring of support for freedom and for Western ideals among the Iranian people, and that wellspring of support could be about to break free. We shall see. I'll report back on developments in Iran on future podcasts. They simply can't be ignored. As we witness the bravery of the protesters in Tehran and elsewhere across that country, it strikes me that they share an ideological bond with the protesters in Hong Kong. Everyone in America and the Western world should watch what's going on in those two places. As I've watched with concern the tendency of the left in America to become less and less aware of and supportive of the criticality of free speech in our society, and I've watched them flirt with dangerous concepts like prohibiting what they characterize as hate speech, it strikes me that as we forget the lessons our own history has taught us about freedom of speech, we should look to the other side of the world for guidance. Those protesters in the streets of Tehran and the streets of Hong Kong know the value of free speech, and they're risking their very lives in support of it. We should all watch, learn, and be reminded of what far too many of us seem to have forgotten. Next topic. Fires down under. If you're like me, you just hate to see animals in peril. And what's happening in Australia right now with the massive brush fires broken out across the country, most intensely in New South Wales, has produced an almost endless string of photographs and videos of animals in peril. Nothing tugs at the heartstrings of an animal lover quite like seeing creatures as adorable as koala bears with singed fur and lungs filled with smoke being rescued by local residents, or to see hundreds of kangaroos covering front yards of houses as they fled to the suburbs to escape the fires. So what caused all of this? Why is Australia suffering these catastrophic brush fires? Well, if you read primarily the mainstream media and if you put your faith at all in environmental activists, you tend to think this is just the latest example of the effects of climate change, the human-caused or anthropogenic global warming. So is it? I don't think so. And what is happening in Australia in terms of media coverage of these events is remarkably similar to what's happened with coverage of fires in California and Brazil. It's become a formula. A natural disaster happens, just as natural disasters have happened all over the world since the dawn of time. If the disaster is particularly severe, or it produces a heart-wrenching photo or set of videos, it's used to publicize a political cause, most commonly in the last decade, climate change. But when you really look into it, what you tend to find is that the events are not unprecedented. They tend to move in cycles. There were events just as severe or more severe in historical periods without large amounts of human carbon emissions, and often there are aggravating circumstances connected with the present events. And in the case of the California and Australian wildfires, there's a connection: the failure to clear out underbrush and deadwood, a failure which is connected to environmental policies promoting virgin, undisturbed natural areas. We saw criticism of that failure coming from President Trump when California suffered its catastrophic wildfires last year. And I've been picking up some of that same pushback from Australian commentators. But most of the coverage from the U.S. media has focused on the massive extent of the fires and the purported connection of the current drought and heat to anthropogenic global warming. And some of it has acknowledged the large number of arrests for negligence or actual arson in starting the fires. Well, I just read an article on CNN.com that may indicate there is a little bit of a coming around to the actual facts of this matter. Now, the article still mentioned global warming, but it focused on the failure to clear undergrowth and deadwood and the failure to use small, low-intensity fires to reduce the amount of fuel available for future wildfires. That's not a new subject. As I mentioned, it goes back to the California wildfires discussed last year, but it actually goes back much further than that. I remember public discussions of that very issue when forest fires overwhelmed Yellowstone National Park in America in 1988. So what was this article on CNN, and what was different about it? It was authored by Lee Ashmelash, and it was entitled, "Australia's Indigenous People Have a Solution for the Country's Wildfires, and It's Been Around for 50,000 Years." So the article was about clearing out undergrowth and deadwood and starting small, controlled fires to prevent massive out-of-control fires in the future. Essentially the same thing talked about by fire experts in response to the massive California fires last year and in 1988 in connection with the Yellowstone conflagration. Do I doubt that the techniques described in the article are and were practiced by indigenous peoples in Australia? Of course not. I have no doubt that their knowledge of and connection to the land put them in a position to perfect such practices. But they're not limited to Australia, and wildfire experts are well aware of the practices in general. What most interests me here is the angle the CNN article took, because as with most of these events, the country involved, in this case Australia, has suffered similar events and similar or more severe weather in the past. The argument that climate change is the cause of the events is strained and overstated, as has been the case with so many other natural disasters for at least the last decade. And the now widespread knowledge of the significant involvement of arson in the origin of these fires has similarly undermined the claims of those who say they're the fault of climate change. In acknowledging the failure to adequately maintain natural areas for fire control, the CNN article represents a significant adjustment of U.S. media coverage of the fires. What's interesting to me is the form that acknowledgment took, and I think it's evidence of just how cautious the left-leaning mainstream media has become at the prospect of pushing against the bounds of political correctness. focusing on inadequate fire prevention butts up against the desire of the environmental left to focus on climate change. CNN risked blowback from the left. How was that potential for blowback mitigated? What was mitigated by the focus of the coverage on the fire prevention capabilities of Aboriginal peoples? Belief in global warming is one of the fundamental orthodoxies of the left, but as it's currently structured, belief in intersectionality is even more fundamental for the left. Belief in the struggles of the oppressed of society against the oppressors of society may now be the most fundamental of all beliefs on the left. So if you're going to publish an article that criticizes the lack of fire prevention steps taken by federal, state, and local government and risk blowback from the environmental left, the criticism needs to come in the form of criticism of Europeans and a celebration of Aboriginal peoples, such as this quote from the article. Quote, "When early Europeans tried to copy Aboriginal techniques by lighting fires, they made the fires too hot and got even more of the flammable scrub. So they tried again and again." Close quote. And quoting Australian National University Emeritus Professor Bill Gamage, quote, "Even though people can see the Aborigines doing the fire control and could see the benefits, they couldn't copy it," close quote, he said. Quote, "Where the Aboriginal people are in charge, they're not having big fires," close quote, Gamage said. Quote, "In the South, where white people are in charge, we are having the problems," close quote. I don't dispute that Aborigines are probably better at fire prevention in the wildlands of Australia. What I find interesting is the question of whether CNN would have published the article if it only criticized the fire protection techniques used in Australia. That is, failing to clear out undergrowth and deadwood and start small, controlled fires, and didn't focus on the Aborigines having perfected the technique in Australia. I don't know the answer for certain, but I have a strong suspicion, a very strong suspicion. And that suspicion is just one more reason why the media needs to get back to doing its job of informing the public and speaking truth to power rather than acting as the propaganda arm for a nearly endless set of left-wing causes. And as I and others wait, hopefully not in futility, for the media to make that change, we'll continue to watch the events in Australia and the dedication of the citizens who've done their best to save so many of the unique and precious animals which inhabit the land down under. Godspeed to the brave firefighters who journey into the wilderness to try to corral these conflagrations and bring them under control. Our thoughts and prayers are with all of you in the great land down under. I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits, and hopefully listeners from Australia and America and all around the world will join me once again. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And last week's episode, number 69, is up on Instagram now as well, with the link to the podcast page on Liberated Syndication. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.